I'm Dr. Deniz Marti. I study human decision making and how cognitive biases influence our decisions. Today, I want to talk about some of the most influential research ever conducted on biases and stereotypes, specifically in the context of women in STEM. This work or this accumulation of work that has fundamentally changed how psychologists understand inequality in education and workplace. So in a landmark study published in Science in 2015, researchers Leslie and others explored a question that has long puzzled educators and policymakers. Why are some academic disciplines far less diverse than others, even when the ability is widely distributed as far as we know? For years, the conversation about gender gaps has focused primarily on STEM. But when researchers broadened the lens across the entire academic spectrum, a surprising pattern emerged. Representation varies dramatically not just between STEM and non-STEM fields, but within them. For example, the researchers show that women earn roughly half of all PhDs in molecular biology and neuroscience, yet fewer than 20% in physics and computer science. So, what explains this uneven landscape? Researchers surveyed over 1,800 faculty members, postdocs, and graduate students across 30 disciplines in the US, and the result was striking. The stronger a field believed that success requires innate talent, the fewer women are represented at the doctoral level. They have shown a clear pattern. The more strongly members of a discipline emphasize the importance of brilliance for achieving success in the field, the lower the representation of women at the doctoral level. So importantly, alternative explanations did not account for this pattern. So it wasn't about women valuing hard work more than men, or even when the researchers balanced responses across genders, the belief that brilliance is necessary remain the strongest predictor of women representation. So when a field signals that only the naturally gifted can thrive, several things can happen. So first of all, the evaluators, often unconsciously, may question whether certain groups possess this innate aptitude. Cultural stereotypes linking the intellectual, this innate talent, primarily with men may become activated, and individuals who internalize these signals may experience stereotype threat or diminished belonging, the sense of belonging. And lastly, some highly capable people may decide the field is not for them. So the question of why are some fields and occupations more diverse than others has been explored recently by another very powerful study. A 2023 review by Muradoli and colleagues offers a compelling explanation through what researchers called FAB, field-specific ability beliefs. At its core, the model proposes that diversity is shaped not only by talent pipelines or institutional policies, but by a powerful intersection of cultural beliefs. So what do I mean by that? The framework points to the convergence of two widely shared assumptions. First, the belief that success in certain fields requires exceptionally high levels of intellectual ability, often described as brilliance. And second, the cultural stereotype that associates with the type of intellectual brilliance are more strongly associated with white men than with other groups. When these two beliefs coexist within a field or occupation, they can create environments that feel less accessible to those who are stereotypes as lacking innate talent. And importantly, the FAB model focuses on perceptions rather than actual abilities. It is not a claim about who can succeed what, but it is about how beliefs shape expectations and the sense of belonging and ultimately the participation. A key aspect of FAB model is its focus on early development. By examining how these beliefs emerge in childhood and identifying the environments that shape them, researchers gain valuable insight in how their long-term effects may be reduced. For example, a study conducted in the Midwestern United States found that girls aged 6 to 7, unlike 5-year-olds, were less likely than boys, often the same age, to describe their own gender as really, really smart in quotation marks, suggesting that the stereotype about brilliance can begin actually in early life. Let's talk about gender stereotypes, the scientists who helped us understand how powerful they really are. Psychologist Naomi Elimers, in a comprehensive review published in Annual Review of Psychology, explains that gender stereotypes shape the way we attend to, interpret, and remember information about both ourselves and others. In other words, these stereotypes do not simply exist at the level of opinion, they actively influence our perception. So where do these beliefs come from then? Social psychologists Albert Bandura and Kay Bussey offered an important insight about that. They argued that even if gender stereotypes contain a small kernel of truth, that kernel is far too limited to justify the sweeping assumptions people often make about essential differences between men and women. Much of what we interpret as natural differences may instead reflect social learning, the process through which cultural expectations teach us how women and men are supposedly meant to behave. From a cognitive standpoint, stereotypes serve as a function, right? So they help make us rapid judgments about unfamiliar people or simplify an otherwise complex social world. However, what is helpful for estimating how groups might differ becomes far less reliable when evaluating individual potential. That's why these research are very important to understand what is actually an innate talents and what is actually a social, just a cultural story. When group-based expectations guide our judgments, stereotypes can actually exaggerate perceived differences between men and women, as we discussed in the first video, and reinforce the psychological boundaries between them. And over time, these boundaries can subtly legitimize role differentiation and can contribute to persistent social stories like inequalities, and often without conscious intent of the individuals who are making the decision. So importantly, gender stereotypes are widely shared, and women and men can internalize them from an early childhood, and their consequences affect not only those who rely on these expectations, but also those who are evaluated through them. An experimental work, for example, by Mas Rakusin and collaborators provide another striking example. When faculty members evaluated identical application materials, candidates with male names were rated as more competent and were offered higher salaries and greater mentoring opportunities than candidates with female names. And the pattern extends beyond science. Another research by Pradfu and colleagues demonstrated that the same architectural design was judged differently depending on whether it was attributed to a male or a female architect. So what do all these studies reveal, right? Stereotypes are cultural artifacts. They actively shape evaluation, opportunities, decision making in the workplace. Now let's turn to another powerful force that shapes gender stereotypes. Of course, you guessed it, the media. Research shows that the media representations consistently reinforce stereotypical expectations about women and men. Across advertisements, television shows, and news coverage, and now social media, men are far more likely to be portrayed in expert and leadership roles. And while women are often depicted in caregiving positions. Even visual framing matters in the media that we notice or we don't necessarily notice. Studies have found that photographs frequently present men by focusing on their faces and upper bodies, and of course emphasizing the competence and authority, whereas women are more often shown in full body images. So the subtle difference can actually encourage viewers to evaluate women based on appearance, based on their body and clothing and body shape, rather than their expertise. So this is a very important representation issue in the media. Media narratives can also differ in how they cover public achievement. Reports tend to highlight men's accomplishments, whether in sports or science and politics, while discussions about women are more likely to focus on their appearance or their personal lives. There is some research that shows that. A striking example, for example, occurred during 2016, a Wimbledon tournament, when coverage of tennis player, as you all know her, Serena Williams, devoted a notable attention to her outfit. Yes, you heard it right, her outfit, rather than her extraordinary athletic performance. So this is a very important example of how women are actually represented or mentioned or covered in the media. Traditional media is only part of this story, right? Online environments, social media can amplify these patterns. So for example, search engines, right? Search engine image results have been criticized for returning heavily gender stereotype representations of occupations. For example, showing mostly men when searching for doctor, the word doctor or physician, and mostly women for nurse, right? These algorithmic outputs do not simply reflect the cultural narratives, but they can also actively reproduce and normalize the existing biases. Of course, these portrayals are not harmless, right? A major review research found that repeated exposure to gender stereotypical media messages shapes the beliefs girls at early ages develop about gender roles, their bodies, and even expectations within romantic relationships. Mental evidence reinforces this concern. Research shows that in one study, undergraduate students who played a video game as a highly sexualized female character reported lower self-efficacy afterward. And this suggests that representation can directly influence confidence and perceived capability. Such an interesting story. So what should we take from all these striking and foundational studies? First of all, let me tell you, stereotypes are not sustained only through individual beliefs. It's not an individual issue. It's embedded. They're embedded in the cultural environments, the cultural narratives that we consume every day, either through media or the interactions that we make with the other members of the society. And over time, these repeated signals help define what seems normal, what appears competent, and who likes or who belongs in positions of expertise, right? And when those signals accumulate, they can quietly shape people's aspirations, their decisions, their life choices, and opportunities long before individuals even enter a classroom or workplace. Now let's turn to something even more subtle than the language. Let's talk about nonverbal communication. Research by evolutionary psychologist Mary Cashton shows that men and women often adopt different physical posture in public settings. This sounds naive, right? Yeah, of course, they have different bodies, they may have different postures, but they show that men tend to display more expansive and open postures, spreading their arms, extending their legs, and taking up more physical space, whereas women, by contrast, are more likely to adopt contractive postures, such as crossing their arms or legs or making themselves physically smaller. So this is not simply about personal preference. They controlled for several factors, right? So multiple social forces shape these patterns. Maybe clothing norms like pants versus skirts, maybe average differences in body size and early childhood messages about what counts as appropriate. So these are important subtle messages that women and men at early ages absorb, and then their behaviors. Many girls are implicitly encouraged to be polite, composed, while boys are often given more permission to occupy space freely, that the researchers show. So the story goes even deeper. Another research by Soledad de Lemus and colleagues suggests that merely activating gender stereotypes, sometimes without people even realizing it, so merely activating gender stereotypes can lead women to adopt more contractive body postures. And that is actually a very interesting social exposure, right? So pause on that for a moment. This means that the social environment doesn't just shape how others see us, it can also shape how we physically present ourselves in a public setting. So expansive postures are often associated with confidence, authority, and leadership presence, as we know. And contractive postures, on the other hand, may be associated with or interpreted as hesitation or lower status, even when competence is actually identical. So that's another very important research. So what begins as subtle behavioral differences can actually influence the perception, evaluation, and opportunity. So let's take everything together, all the foundational studies that we discussed. This research reveals an important insight. Non-verbal behaviors operate largely below conscious awareness, and they can quietly actually reinforce assumptions about who belongs in positions of expertise and leadership and visibility and power. Even the non-verbals can actually influence that, which of course raises an important reflection that I want to mention, is that how much of what we interpret as confidence in an employee and a leader is actually competence, or how much is simply the freedom to take up space. So let's examine another subtle yet extremely powerful mechanism through which gender stereotypes are reinforced: language. Social psychologist Anne Maas demonstrated that the words we use to describe others are often shaped by our underlying stereotypes. Interesting. Her research shows that when someone behaves in ways that align with stereotypical expectations, we tend to describe that behavior using abstract language, typically adjectives. Very interesting social psychology research, actually. For example, we might say, he is brilliant, or she's nurturing. Okay, interesting what they found. When individuals behave in ways that challenge those stereotypes, our language often shifts. So from being an adjective-based language to more concrete action verbs. So instead of abstract descriptions like adjectives, we rely on concrete action verbs, such as she solved the problem, he helped the team. At first glance, this may sound like, just like a minor semantic linguistic issue. But further research by Daniel Wigbaldas and colleagues reveals why this matters so much. I find this research very interesting. Abstract language, using adjectives for example, communicates something stable about person. He is a problem solver, or she's a nurturing person. So it's a stable trait, it's a lasting trait, part of their identity. Whereas concrete language, by contrast, suggests that a behavior is temporary, it's conditional, it's situational, or perhaps even an exception, it implies. So consider this contrast. When a boy excels in math, or let's say in any STEM field, we might say, he is very smart. When a girl achieves the same result, some people may say, she did well on the test. So the achievements are identical, But the psychological message is not identical, because one fits the stereotype, the other doesn't fit the stereotype. So in one example we use abstract terms, the other one we use, hopefully not we, but people tend to use concrete terms. One implies innate ability, he is very smart, but the other implies some kind of a performance. Oh, on that day she did well on the test. Over time, these small linguistic differences actually accumulate. Even when we recount examples that contradict stereotypes, the structure of our language can actually quietly preserve the broader belief system. So what makes this especially important is that these patterns operate largely outside of conscious awareness, and most people are not intentionally reinforcing stereotypes. They're not even aware of that, and this is what this class is about. They're simply speaking in ways that feel familiar, natural. Yet language is not just descriptive, also it's constructive. It is very important to realize that the words we choose, the way we describe things, actually construct how we think. It shapes how people see themselves and how they are seen by others. So gender stereotypes are not just sustained only through media or institutions. They're embedded in every conversation, in our classrooms, in our workplaces, in our leadership, even casual interactions, like what kind of words we're using. And once you become aware of this phenomena, you begin to hear these kind of differences everywhere, which leads to another important question. If our words can subtly communicate who naturally belongs in positions of competence or in positions of power, what responsibility do we carry in choosing them more carefully? Another important research by Alice Eagley and Antonio Mladinic show that women who conform to traditional gender expectations are often judged more favorably than women who challenge those norms, challenge those traditional gender expectations. So this suggests that approval is not just distributed solely based on performance, right? It is tied to whether behavior actually aligns with socially accepted roles, the traditional roles. What is particularly striking, in my opinion, is in this research is that both men and women tend to endorse these beliefs. So studies indicate a shared perception that men are not only more competent than women, but they should be more competent. Similarly, women are often expected to embody warmth and communality, not just as a tendency, but almost like a social obligation. They must show warmth. They must show communality. And this pattern was documented in another research by Ramos and colleagues. They highlight how descriptive beliefs easily transform into prescriptive standards. So descriptive, what they should be what they are doing. Prescriptive is what they should be doing. Okay? After discussing all this important research, what can we actually do with this knowledge? Another research by psychologist Naomi Elmers argue that gender stereotypes do far more than shape what we see others. So they also influence what we see ourselves, our ambitions we consider appropriate, the behaviors we believe are desirable, and even the life outcomes we come to value. And here's the paradox, right? When people strongly believe that gender stereotypes accurately reflect reality, reflect what the world is actually happening or occurring, when people strongly believe that gender stereotypes accurately reflect reality, those very beliefs can prevent individuals, men and women, from expressing their unique abilities or pursuing paths aligned with their true interests. In other words, stereotypes can become self-fulfilling. Even if stereotypes contain what researchers call a tiny kernel of truth, that kernel persists largely because expectations shape behaviors, our desires. And behavior then appears to confirm the expectation. But the good news is that the research offers clear guidance on how we can respond. Also, Naomi Ellemers argue 5 takeaways for the benefit of awareness. And this course is all about that. Awareness of biases and stereotypes, awareness of gender biases and stereotypes. And again, this is not just a women issue, this is a men and women all together. First, we must acknowledge how pervasive gender stereotypes are, period. That's what Naomi Ellemers says. Simply recognizing that all of us are exposed to those expectations and that they can bias our judgments is the very first powerful step. And importantly, studies by Kaiser Rand colleagues and colleagues warn that we cannot just solely rely on good intentions, because many biases operate implicitly, assuming fairness without actively examining our decisions can allow inequality to persist. The second takeaway, responsibility for identifying bias should not rest only on those who are disadvantaged. So, in other words, it's not a women issue that to identify those women-related biases. Research by Benjamin Drury and Cheryl Kaiser suggests that interventions are more effective when individuals in advantaged positions help recognize and correct unequal treatment. It's very important. Social change accelerates when those with influence participate in challenging the system. We even see this dynamic within families. Work by Alice Croft and colleagues and research done by these scholars show that when fathers take an active role in household responsibilities, their daughters are more likely to develop aspirations that challenge traditional stereotypes. Third takeaway of the benefit of being aware of the biases is that education matters. When people understand that the stereotypes are both descriptive, in other words, telling us what supposedly is, and prescriptive, telling us what supposedly should be, what women must do, what men must do or should do, they become better equipped to question these assumptions. Researchers Joan Williams and Rachel Dempsey emphasize that awareness helps individuals develop practical strategies for navigating gendered expectations. And the fourth takeaway is that organizations play a critical role. Studies by also Ellemers and von Steenbergen reveal that employees experience less stress and demonstrate higher satisfaction and greater performance, when supervisors support the integration of work and family roles rather than treating them as competing demands. And finally, we must rethink how we define social and professional roles. The traditional divide, where masculine roles emphasize competition and achievement, power and leadership, while feminine roles emphasize care and empathy. But it no longer reflects the realities of modern life. Research by Amanda Diekman and colleagues showed that highlighting the full range of skills required in today's modern workplaces attracts more diverse participation both from men and women. When we limit roles to narrow stereotypes, those narrow stereotypes, everyone loses. The organizations lose, the families lose, individuals lose. Gender stereotypes can prevent both women and men from sharing caregiving responsibilities equally. They can make it harder for successful women to find partners or men outside traditional breadwinner roles to feel valued. They can obscure the emotional weight carried by caregivers and the physical demands faced by laborers. And those are not just individual costs, the emotional cost to the individuals, they're also societal costs. They affect the well-being, the family resilience, and the long-term strength of the workforce. As we mentioned, even organizations can attract more diverse talent if they actually apply the rules that we just mentioned in the research. So perhaps the most important takeaway is this: stereotypes persist not because they're accurate and they're testing or they're passing the time test. It's because they're repeated. They're constantly repeated in roles and expectations, in everyday interactions. That's why it's very important to understand the stereotypes, the gender stereotypes, and how, as individuals, we can change our language, we can increase our awareness, we can consume the media differently, and we can actually define our role for ourselves, consistent with our interests, not consistent with the stereotypes that we're trying to fit in.